When I was 7, I went camping with my parents and baby sister in Virginia. We were staying in a campground specifically, but there were also some cabins available to rent in the area. On the first day there, after constantly protesting for them to allow me to take a walk, my dad complained to my mom that I was old enough to walk the short distance to the park and play without their supervision for a moment. My mom has always been very overprotective and a true warrior, even more so after this camping trip. My mom finally gave in to our combined pleadings and allowed me to go to the campground park. While at the playground, I met a little girl around my own age. We played together for a long while. She was also by herself, so I invited her to come back to our RV to play some Barbies together. We started heading in that direction. On the way back, we crossed paths with my parents, who were going to another family's RV to visit and socialize with them. We let them know that we were going to play Barbies in our RV together. After we'd played for a little while, she suggested we pick up the Barbies and go to the cabin she and her grandparents were staying in to play there. I agreed. The thought never occurred to me that my parents didn't know this girl or her family, or where I would be going. They likely assumed we were going to stay in the RV and play together there the whole time. Now, we played at her cabin for quite a long while. While we played together, her grandparents seemed to be packing up their things, preparing to leave the campground. When they were all packed up and ready to go, they said that they would take me back to the RV on their way there, so I wouldn't have to walk that whole way. Obviously, my parents had always told me to never ever get in the car with a stranger. I knew this, but it just never occurred to me that this was exactly the sort of situation they meant by that. I mean, genuinely, I never felt afraid or concerned even in the slightest about this situation. The little girl's grandparents packed up their car and all of us climbed in. We stopped at the campground's general store, and her grandfather got both of us some ice cream. All I could think about was how this man was so kind and generous. When we got back into the car again, I assumed they would be next dropping me off in the RV. I stayed in the car eating my ice cream and talking with my new friend, completely oblivious to the outside world. All of a sudden, the car stopped abruptly. My dad flew in out of nowhere and threw the door open, tears pouring down his cheeks. He yanked me out of the car and hugged me so hard that I thought I was going to pass out. I was just confused. The car I had just been in then sped away very quickly. It was then that I realized we were all the way at the exit of the campground. Apparently, upon returning to our RV and finding that my new friend and I were gone, my parents had contacted the ranger station, and a lot of people went out to find me. They actually went door to door to different RVs. My dad just happened to be walking by when he saw me in another person's car. I don't know who those people were, but they definitely had no intention at all of bringing me back to my parents. I think the ice cream they bought me was to distract me from noticing details. Over the years, I've often thought back to that day and just how different my life would have been now if it was not for my dad showing up in that exact moment. Had he not seen me just in the nick of time, I might be living a totally different life right now. Just a little bit of background information. I'm a 26-year-old woman, kind of a tomboy. The way I grew up, I was always climbing trees, playing in the dirt, and never even touched a doll or a dress. Back in the summer of 2002, I was 16 at the time. My boyfriend asked me to go on a camping trip with him and his parents. Me being the tomboy I was, I graciously accepted his offer. It sounded like a lot of fun. His parents were planning on a weekend of us going out rafting, boating, swimming, the whole works. I was in absolute paradise. Now, they had an RV, and it was fully furnished as well. I slept in the kitchen and living room area. As a side note, right in the middle of the woods was a designated camping area. It was so quiet and peaceful, you could hear the river in the stillness of the night. It was very soothing. I remember thinking to myself, man, I could live here forever. The next day was probably the funnest day of my life. We went out kayaking together. It was around 1 p.m. My boyfriend's dad decided to have a cookout around that time. I can't remember the last time I lost track of time so much and just enjoyed myself so much the day flew right by. Before I knew it, it was already time for us to go to bed once more. We had a big plan for the next day, and I was eager to get to sleep so I could wake up and have that much fun all over again. I remember laying awake though, just staring at the ceiling. My boyfriend was snoring and I was laughing as quietly as I could. It was not very loud, but it was somewhat amusing. That was the last laugh I'd have for a long time though, before my life was literally changed forever. All of a sudden, there was a tapping on the side of the RV. That sound really caught me off guard. I wasn't really alarmed though. I chalked it up to maybe a random noise perhaps. You know, maybe an animal or the RV just creaking by itself. I wasn't scared or anything. I tried to sleep it off and just ignore it, but that's when I began to hear an unmistakable giggling sound. I thought that maybe my boyfriend's parents were awake and trying to mess around with us. I listened in a bit closer. Silence washed over the place again, and I could hear the river rushing outside. There was the ringing in my ears as well, the kind you get when there's a real eerie silence. I had this sinking feeling in my stomach that I hear a lot of people get when they think something bad's about to happen. I felt it in that moment. In the dead silence, I heard that giggle again, followed by a scraping sound coming from outside the RV. My heart practically jumped into my throat, and I felt tears in my eyes. Somebody was clearly outside. I was scared stiff though. I couldn't move a muscle. That scraping sound continued. I whispered to my boyfriend, trying to wake him up, but he just kept on snoring. I heard the sound moving until about 5 feet away from the main door, before there was more silence. My heart was beating so fast I was afraid I was going to have a heart attack. I tapped against my chest, trying to calm myself down. I was just watching the square hole in the door. All of a sudden, I saw a small thing just appear out of the darkness. I almost shrieked out of fear. I could see it appeared to be the hand of a young girl. Looking a bit closer, I could see it appeared to be one of those fake ones you'd get from Walmart, but that didn't stop me from freaking out a lot. I sat up and started screaming. I mean, really started wailing. My boyfriend's parents staggered into the room. All I could do was point at the door. My boyfriend's dad went to open it, but there was a sudden loud crash. He then fell back inside, falling onto the couch out cold. A rock then fell onto the floor. That's when my boyfriend woke up and started shouting. The mom was going insane and turned over to her husband. I was screaming and still in shock. When I finally stopped screaming, I could hear hysterical laughter coming from outside, followed by footsteps on top of the RV. They were up on the roof. I could hear a higher-pitched nasally voice coming from outside the RV. None of us had cell phones in 2002. We were just now starting to get into the cell phone craze, so we were truly in the middle of nowhere with no way to contact anyone. There would be no help. The RV was now rocking, with somebody obviously jumping up and down on top of it. There was a crash on the side door frame as the man on top smashed it with something. He was screaming and laughing and trying to mock us. That managed to sober us up a bit, though. My boyfriend grabbed a gun from one of the cupboards. He opened the door and fired out into the darkness. The pacing on the roof immediately stopped, and the shrieking outside stopped as well. Everything returned to silence once more. I looked over at my boyfriend. There was a window right behind him. I could see a face in it. I knew it was a man because I could make out the outline of a thick beard on him. That was all I could really see. The man outside raised a gloved hand and started waving at me. I moved my boyfriend away from the window. I looked back and the man was now gone. We drove out of the campsite that night. The RV had suffered a broken window, and my boyfriend's dad had to go to the hospital for a concussion with a rock had hit him in the head. The parents called the police the next morning, and officers went out and searched the area. They couldn't find anything though. Neither footprints nor firewood or anything like that. After that, I had to go through counseling and therapy because I had quite a bit of trouble sleeping. About 2 years after that, my boyfriend and I actually broke up due to the stress and trauma I was going through because of it. Eventually, I did start to get better, but it took a long time. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved out there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens, the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state in the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us who are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by. We're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by various woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none is stranger than the one I'm about to tell you. We lived on top of a hill about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 or so miles away. It was quiet and few if any vehicles ever came by our house. Because of that, I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them coming from miles away. I mean, of course there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts or something. We didn't even have names on our roads. They were all designated by simple numbers. As I got older, I wasn't as scared of the vehicles passing by during the day. I knew that most of the cars and trucks that went by were distant, friendly neighbors. When night came, well, that was a different story altogether. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and lighting up my walls like some kind of ominous paint job. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time this happened, I was 13. The year was 1996. Our family had amazingly just acquired the internet. Anyone in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a sliding glass door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time. That's unlike nowadays, where every family member has their own personal computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually a nice and appreciated gesture. Well, I appreciated it for all of about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing about in Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing some Myst. That was when I heard it, mostly felt it at first, the low rumbling of a truck's engine creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back to life in an instant. Nothing good could come from such a suspicious vehicle driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to an immediate stop. A man threw open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He was wearing some kind of puffy vest jeans and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck. He then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be screaming at him and ordering him to do something. He motioned for him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could clearly see this guy was unnerved. His partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 or 4 minutes, paused, and then looked back at the driver. The two exchanged some words I couldn't quite make out. They then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I could only describe it as looking like a closed sleeping bag, with a body obviously still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt at covering up the hole before they sped away in a hurry. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried there? The answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. That's the creepiest part of it all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw was real because the tire tracks were still there from the night before, but whatever they'd thrown into that hole was now gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight out into the forest. I had no idea what to make of all this. I've repressed this memory for so long, and I just wanted to pretend like it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they tried to bury in the ground had someone in it. They must have thought the person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, clearly they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I said. There are some things you'll see in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't much like the answer. My dad owned a small house for a brief amount of time. This particular house was not one that he lived in, though. He bought the place to renovate and resell it for a profit. This house was on a dead-end street out in the woods. It was a very private location, but the road had a history of people dumping things off or abandoning stolen vehicles there. There were only 2 houses on that street. This house was often used by drifters. A neighbor told us it had been a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the house, he called me to ask if I would meet him there to help him unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did, and I noticed that there was already a car in front of the house. I decided to go investigate to see if there was anyone in the car. I saw that there was clothing piled up in the back seat. As I walked around this car, I started to have this uneasy feeling that I was not alone. I could hear someone out moving in the woods near the house. I went and stood at the edge of the woods for several minutes, watching and waiting. My dad arrived a short while later with his trailer in tow. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I told him I had a feeling that whoever owned this vehicle was still close by, and that I'd heard someone walking around in the woods before he got there. He looked over to the car just like I did. Then we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we could find anyone hiding there. As we were walking around, I got the distinct feeling we were being watched by someone. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we actually found a dead body or something. He said he was having the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The pathway we were on came to a dead end, so we turned back. The car was still there when we returned. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned vehicle. After getting off the phone with them, we went inside the home to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes. When we came back out though, we noticed that the car was already gone. Whoever owned it must have been watching us while we were investigating and decided to take off immediately when we went inside. The police never did show up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, sure enough, a dead body was discovered in the forest right by the home. The person who found the body was a lady who was hiking through the area. There was a neighbor who attempted to tell her about the body before she found it, but that neighbor had a reputation for being a mentally unstable drunk, so no one believed him when he tried to warn them. After the body was found, the police came out to do a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad. My dad said the detective was acting quite strange and uninterested though. I refused to believe that it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area not long before the body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, they never followed up with the neighbor after the body was found. He had a conversation with him months after this happened, right before he sold off the house. The story gets even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse stated that it looked like it hadn't been there for very long, meaning that it wasn't a rotting heap. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. The police would later report that the body had been there for years. Something tells me that isn't true. If the body really had been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It all just doesn't add up. It really makes me wonder what could have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of the car that day. This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us to unload as well. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hello to us. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off him. Our daughter, who to this day is still way too friendly to strangers, even hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but we mainly paid more attention to unloading our things than chatting with our newly acquired neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go fuck off. Later that night, me and my husband were going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. or so when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza I'd ordered, my husband opened the door, only to be surprised when there stood Ben instead. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could even tell him to get lost though, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, he was also just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him that, he got a bit angry and started screaming and yelling at my husband. He began to pound on the wall as well. This guy was completely unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived right across the way from us at the time and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that he was the residential pest and suffered from various mental issues. Overall, he was harmless though, as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear your first night in a new place. After that, we kind of fell into the new place and settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just try to ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed ASAP. He would always try to ask me for cigarettes when he could catch me, and I kept telling him I didn't smoke. My husband said he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw off Ben a little. At first, it worked out. But then Ben started to pester us during the day instead. On our days off, we'd take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us. He said he was really great with kids, and we should trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just had my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot and said he was making sure no one parked in it while we were away. He then ran up and tried to hug our daughter. She screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I rushed her into the house, while my husband finally snapped and really gave him an earful, telling him to leave us alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card again. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter. We have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter couldn't even go outside because she was afraid the bad man would be out there. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors even told me that he and another neighbor had once saw Ben hiding and staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool. They chased him off and reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. He wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he'd moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town for work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play some Saints Row and relax after having just worked an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. I looked and saw it was about 10 p.m. At this point, if anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, though, it began to shake violently, and then I heard Ben screaming, "Open the goddamn door!" His heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against it. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone and the sharpest knife we had from the kitchen. I did the hide in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, at least there would be something in between us. I called 911, and they said my other neighbors had already called it in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens and the voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out and see what was going on. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, even added in their own experiences. My sweet churchly neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on. She even let me stay with her and her family for the night. After what happened, I couldn't sleep at all, though. I kept thinking that at any moment, I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. Turns out, Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it the landlord was well aware, but willingly overlooked it, as Ben's family would slip him some extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. It really makes me sick. Ben did take his meds, but he hadn't been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her. that I was having an affair with him. And crazy, right? The last thing I heard, he'd been placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was a prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we did check all our neighbors for red flags. My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and a temperature drop into the negatives was occurring. Snow was falling in thick layers on the ground. It was around 10 p.m. or so. My mother had just finished up her classes, and by then it was already dark. Bear in mind, in China, it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through an old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There were also no lamp posts around. It was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going, but she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar with the area and knew her way back home. As she was walking, though, my mother started to get this feeling that someone was lurking off in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But when she suddenly stopped, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked but continued forward and pretended she hadn't noticed anything. She thought maybe it was another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from moving faster. She began to pick up her pace. The crunching snow behind her also began to speed up as well. My mother couldn't handle the fear anymore and started running. The thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She gave a quick look behind her to see who was following, only to be greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in quickly. The man did not appear to be wearing any protection despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. That's not what scared my mom the most, though. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant's stall. When she looked back, she was able to see her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street nearby. Luckily, at that very moment, there happened to be a young couple walking right towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran right up to them and collapsed in front of them. My mom was in absolute hysterics. When they asked her what was wrong, she explained to them what happened. By then, though, the stranger had already disappeared back into the darkness. The couple that she ran into happened to be living on the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father as well. They accompanied her on the journey back home, and they told my grandfather where they'd found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would always meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her mysterious assailant was, but thankfully she never had another encounter with the man again. In summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room, and I was working on my schoolwork. My brother and boyfriend were playing a video game together in the next room over. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph, I called my parents to let them know I would be gone for a few minutes, but I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes away from my home, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping the gas into my car, though, an older beat-up truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sort of sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling up my tank. Before I got back into my car, though, I decided to head into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I walked inside, quickly picked out some items, and just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store with guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built. "Everybody get on the ground!" the first man shouted. The cashier and everybody else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair. "You stand," he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him and stomped his foot, attempted to punch his face even, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part is I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me, "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier to hand over the cash or to quote, "You're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall." I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer in the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter. I fell to the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police, and within seconds were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed to be okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I weakly asked him. My stomach was still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops was very good friends with my father. He'd entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out a customer had snuck into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. The officer asked if I needed any medical attention, but I shook my head and cried that I just wanted to go home. As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. It then clicked in my head that vehicle belonged to the two men. They must have been scoping the place out, waiting for the right time to strike. I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually, we came to my neighborhood, and my mom ran out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me up in his arms. He held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was laying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again.